Hello class. In this video, I will be going through the lesson content for the Critical Perspectives on Technology Module 1 Power Part 2. A lot of words there, but this is the second half of the Power module, which is introduced and covered in these Critical Perspectives on Technology modules in the class. So I will proceed. These slides also are available for you to access on your own outside of this video, but this video is here for me to go through the content, elaborate more on certain points, really trying to make sure that the information is conveyed clearly. And there is an associated activity for you to complete as well. Information about that is on Blackboard. The agenda in this lesson is to look at historical materialism, which is a content that is important for understanding various shifts in history. And then there'll be an analysis of history as modes of production. And then we'll look at alienation. And the activity that you will complete is about alienation today. For things in this lesson, like the analysis of history as modes of production, I also encourage you to pause at certain times, look at the slides yourself, or just reflect for yourself to try to come up with some thoughts and ideas and conclusions about what's being covered here. Because, of course, since it is a video, there isn't much back and forth or any back and forth happening between us, like in discussion format, but that means there's also opportunity for you to take a moment when something maybe sticks into your mind, and you can pause the video, just think on it for a little bit, start to develop some thoughts, articulate some ideas around those concepts or whatever it is that compelled you to start thinking about something. So first, we'll look at historical materialism. So this is a interesting concept and theory here we're going to look at. And I have my laser pointer right here. But now it also has my cursor. I wonder why that is. Okay, so historical materialism comes from, there we go, no more cursor, comes from a guy, Karl Marx. I'm sure this is someone whose name you have heard come up quite often, or maybe not super often, but definitely his name still persists today, right? Marx, specifically his last name, Marxist, right? That's used a lot in political speak. We're going to be looking at ideas presented by Karl Marx, right? And again, while his name is thrown around a lot in some of the modern political discourse, I do think oftentimes it's used probably incorrectly, and people maybe just use it as a term to describe someone who maybe just thinks differently than them. And so we're just going to cover his ideas because they are very important and they have been very impactful and influential in terms of being able to understand the world, the state of society, especially since industrial times and post-industrial, and again the Industrial Revolution, which we looked at last week in class, or last time we met. So Marx is a German-born philosopher. He lived from 1818 to 1883. So he witnessed industrialization and analyzed the ways in which it changed society, as well as its potential future implications, right? So Marx was a philosopher, someone who was very interested in thinking about the world, critiquing what was happening, and what was happening during his time was this industrialization of society, basically. And as someone who was watching this happen and who was interested in thinking about the world in grander scale, he was really starting to think about the implications of this shift in society and what it would cause and bring about, many of which is the situation that we still live in today. He was interested in the structures of society and how it relates to history, power, and inequality, right? Again, these modules are about power, so a lot of his ideas really are about power, who has power, what is that power utilized for, and how that also relates to technology. He's a critic of capitalism and how it creates a class structure between the ruling classes, the bourgeoisie, and the working classes, the proletariat. Bourgeoisie and proletariat are the terms that he uses sort of academically in his writing and his ideas, but you can think of them as the ruling classes and the working classes. His ideas and theories, quote, have exerted enormous influence on modern intellectual, economic, and political history, right? Again, he was really interested in all of these shifts happening, had a lot of ideas about them, and so we're just going to cover some of those approaches in this module. Historical materialism is one of his key ideas. He has a lot of different ideas and thoughts, of course, but this is one that we're going to focus on here because it gives a little bit of a structure in terms of how to understand some of his approach to history and society. So, historical materialism, and here's an interesting AI generated image here for historical materialism. It is the idea that social and economic structures are shaped by the material conditions, the immediate environment of a society. So, historical materialism is Karl Marx's way of understanding how societies change. He believed that the way people make things, like using machines or farming, the way that they sort of actually tend to work and create things, and how they work together affects everything else in society, like its culture, politics, and social structures, right? So this also includes the means of production. So the means of production being land, labor, and capital. Examples of land include natural resources, which include water, oil, coal, etc. Examples of labor is an individual using mental or physical effort to complete a task, which is usually paid for. And capital includes property that is used to produce goods and services such as a work van or a factory. So means of production, I just have that there because that is a term that comes up a lot in his ideas. But historical materialism, again, it's a way of understanding history, a way of understanding how societies change. And it really has to do with how people work and the structure of that work and how it's integrated into society. He believes is key to understanding history. As well as, through understanding history, better understanding the present moment. So his idea of historical materialism is largely built on this concept of there being a base and superstructure to society. And this is where you can start to see this as maybe a little bit of a template or framework to trying to understand sort of some of this stuff. So at the base of society is where he believes there are things like the means of production, right, which I touched on here in this slide, but the means of production being things like tools, machines, factories, land, raw materials, right, the things that are utilized to produce, okay? And then also the relations of production, right? So what is the relationship between those who are working and those who maybe own the land and things like that, right? So these are some of the different relations of production, as well as private property, capital, commodities, etc., etc. So what he's interested in is thinking about the base of a society. What are the means of production of a society, okay? Then he believes that the means of production, the base of a society, as well as the relations of who owns the base, right, and how people interact with it, then shapes and maintains the superstructure of society, which are sort of more larger scale, sort of not necessarily metaphorical, but less material things about society. Things like ideology, right? So art, family, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, education. So things that doesn't directly do with production. But he believes that there's a strong link between what are the means of production in a society, right? And how are those means basically owned and spread throughout a society. And then based on that relationship, it then informs things like the law and culture and religion and philosophy, science, and all of these things, education, right, for society. Okay. Then the superstructure, all of these less material things, then maintain and shape the base, right? So it is a cyclical sort of process where the means of production and the way in which that is integrated into society then has an influence on things like education and art and law, which then goes back and then reinforms the means of production. And so if you are seeing this influence strictly in terms of how the base influences the superstructure, that looks more into an idea called technological determinism, right? So the technologies of a society determine everything else about it. Whereas if you see the superstructure and how that informs the base, that is seen more as social constructivism, which is this idea that it is actually the structures of society that construct the technologies within it. Really, it's not so binary, I don't think, right? And that's something we talked about a lot in this class, is trying to get away from binary thinking. So I think it's more valuable to understand how it's a bit more of a cyclical process, and that technologies are determining certain aspects of society, but also some of the social structures then are informing certain things about the technologies and the means of production within a society. So trying to kind of understand those things happening both at the same time, and maybe in some instances it's one thing more than the other, but I don't think that that means that there's only one possible way to see this, right? It seems that it's kind of happening on both ends. So looking at the economic base, so we're going to delve into this here more. So Marx thought the main thing shaping a society is how people earn a living and organize their work. This includes the tools they use and how they interact at work, which has a big impact on everything else in that society. For example, in pre-industrial society, the economic base was primarily agrarian, with serfs cultivating land for lords, right? So that's sort of the relations of production that a serf would have been working on the land of a lord. Excuse me. This economic arrangement not only determined the material conditions, but also structured the social hierarchy, political institutions, and prevailing cultural norms, right? So, pre-industrial society being agrarian, and then the way that that agrarian work was then sort of folded into society through things like serfs and lords, and sort of classes of the time, then informs things like the social hierarchy, the political institutions, as well as the cultural norms of the time. Okay, so that's in pre-industrial society as an example. But again, he's looking at how people earn a living and organize their work, and the relation of that with other aspects of society. Then there's the superstructure, the top part of that. So Marx's ideas says that how people work influences everything else in the society, deemed the superstructure, like culture, government, and ideas. Changes in one affect the others. Example, think about the Industrial Revolution, which we've already looked at and talked about in this class. When machines started doing a lot of work in factories, it changed how people lived and worked. New classes, rules, and even beliefs came about because of these changes in how things were made, right? So thinking about how the factories shifted in the means of production, right, and how people lived and worked then shifted as well. And because of that, new classes emerged, new rules emerged in society, and new beliefs came about because there was a shift in the base, and that influenced the superstructure. Okay, so this is the dynamic that Marx is very interested in understanding. So the thing about this is that he sees this as really a perspective or a lens to understand history, right? So he's not just saying, oh, this only makes sense now in a industrial society that he was living in, but he was saying that actually we can look throughout history and understand how this framework can help us better understand different periods of history. So as a bit of a sort of analysis activity, we're going to go through a few slides here that go through 4 key moments of history as modes of production, right? So if we were to think of history as modes of production, we could think about some key shifts that happened in modes of production throughout human history. So going from a hunter-gatherer to an ancient mode to a feudal mode to a now capitalist mode. And with each era, I do have an image from the time itself that sort of embodies that period, as well as an image generated by AI next to it, right? Consider differences and similarities between the two. I think that that's just kind of interesting to do, but that's kind of a side point. Really, it's important to be thinking about what is the economic base in each mode of production, as well as what tools and technology are used to create this base, and then how does that base influence the superstructure in this mode of production. So if we think about something like the hunter-gatherer mode of production, this being an actual sort of cave painting from that time, this being AI's version of it now, we can think about, right, the means of production at this point in time, the tools being used were maybe sort of some primitive weapons and things like that for hunting. Maybe there was baskets and stuff like that to carry food. And so those tools were being used, right, and integrated into society by people living in tribes or hunter-gatherer societies, and they would be used to hunt, to gather food. And the relationship of how people utilize those tools, in both of these interpretations does seem to be a bit more communal, right? It isn't necessarily that one person has a spear and then they go out and hunt for the whole tribe. It was a more communal sort of effort where everyone was utilizing the different tools and sharing them in how they could contribute to their society, right, their tribe or village as a whole. And so, again, these interpretations here lead us to think that, okay, well, if we were to think about that mode of history of hunter-gatherers as a mode of production, the way in which the tools were utilized in society maybe created a bit more of a communal society, right? Because it wasn't that one person owned all of the tools and you had to rent them from that person, or only they could deem whether or not you could use them. It was a more so sort of spread and shared experience, right? And again, those tools, those technologies being power, when that power is spread more throughout sort of everyone more equally, it creates a more communal society, right? Potentially less power imbalances. And this is a very kind of, simplified way of seeing this. I mean, obviously, we could get way more in detail into actual points of history that we can understand from this point in time, but I'm just trying to get you to see this perspective of history. Then if we look at an ancient mode of production, here is sort of hieroglyphic art from actual ancient Egypt. Here's AI's version. Really interesting how I don't even think that, the prompt that I used explicitly said to represent this. I think I just said, show me an ancient mode of production, basically, and it pretty much replicated the exact image, which is really interesting. So obviously, it must have probably been feeding this information from images like this. Anyway, right, so here we're starting to see a shift in some of the modes of production. Right now, animals are being used as power, sort of plows being used, right? Technologies like that then maybe creates a new relationship as well in the superstructure of these societies of how people relate to animals, right? And there is evidence in ancient Egypt of things like the Sphinx, right? And sort of seeing animals in more spiritual ways. Rather than only as just food or something like that, right? So that's a shift in some of the cultural values of a society, because also there's a shift in the mode of production in that society, right? Additionally, in ancient times, there was dynamics between slaves and, pharaohs and things like that, if we were to look at ancient Egypt, and that creates its own sort of dynamic that then also informs the cultural values of that society, right? And how these pyramids were, being created by slaves, but they are meant to be monuments to these pharaohs, right? That tells us something about the relationship between the people in the society, the maybe different hierarchies within that society, and that is intertwined into the tools and the modes of production they were using and who owned them and how they were utilizing them in their more day-to-day life, right? So Marx, he's interested in thinking not just about the big moments or in history, the big battles or things like that. He's interested in thinking about how did the everyday people actually sort of spend their daily life, and through that, how can we learn more about the hierarchies at play and how power is utilized in those societies. A feudal mode here, right here we have again that example of like a landlord with serfs sort of cultivating the land. Maybe they're getting wheat here or something along those lines. We have an actual interpretation from the time as well as the AI version, but they both use interesting visual ways to demonstrate hierarchy here, right? In terms of the lord is above the serfs, right? Here he's literally on a horse, right? Again, that's in his garb, his sort of armor here, right? Whereas the serfs are just in more traditional clothes. Yeah, so once again, thinking about this dynamic, right? The means of production at this time being the serfs utilizing different tools, right, to cultivate the land, but the dynamic being that this land was then owned by someone who was sort of surveying the whole process, and that dynamic informed a lot about the social structures of the time, the cultural norms of the time, how religion was maybe also used and integrated into those societies, right? We can see this big, potentially religious building that AI generated in the background, right? Maybe that's the true overarching force over both of these people here, right? So interesting to think about this stuff, right? And again, it really is just a way of trying to frame history, right? So rather than seeing, the feudal era in terms of just, okay, who were the kings and what were the deeds that they were doing, it's, well, what was the actual conditions of the people living at that time, and how was technology integrated into that, and then what sort of dynamics did that create, which then informed a lot of the more cultural things, the superstructure of that time. Then we get to now, right, which would be the capitalist mode of production, the Industrial Revolution. And we see here a factory, right? And now we see like the assembly line sort of concept arise, right? And so here we are, workers in a factory. This person is standing up, potentially they're surveying their work. They're watching over them. We can definitely see in this AI version that yes, here's the workers here on these industrial machines, and here's maybe sort of the managers or the factory owners watching over them, right? And so again, Marx was interested in this period of time, and he was really interested in these dynamics that were being created out of these factories, out of these working conditions. Because if we see, this factory here, there's all these sewing machines, but the question is, who owned the sewing machines, right? Well, it was the person who owned the factory. The people would just come and use them, right? So whoever owned the technology, as we talked about before in this class, tended to have the power, which could then be utilized over people, basically, right? And I mean, obviously people needed to eat and survive, and so the society was built around these dynamics where people would own factories with technologies in them, and then they would sort of give out scraps basically to people coming to work in these factories. As we discussed and covered a bit in this class as well already, quite dangerous and bad conditions to work in these factories as well. And the thing about seeing history in terms of these modes of production is to understand that this kind of is also where we still are today. Yes, some of the technologies have shifted, which does impact the base and the superstructure, right, with sort of digital revolution type stuff. However, the dynamic is quite the same now as it was back then in many ways. And that's why, here's a modern example, right, where we can see a factory. I think that this might be Foxconn or, one of the electronic factories where they're creating smartphones and devices and things like that. And once again, we have people sitting here working, creating the technologies, and then we have someone surveying their work here. This is the AI's version of a contemporary capitalist mode of production. It looks like there's a very clear division happening where I don't know if these are the workers here, and then here's the factories where they're creating what looks like some sort of AI overlords, right? So this is how the AI tends to interpret what's going on right now, which is interesting. But what I was getting at before, too, is seeing these shifts of history in these terms leads us to realize that, there actually isn't that much different from now and then. And so when we look at this example that was brought up before in this class, and thinking about the value of history, and we were looking at commuters in the 1950s and commuters in the 2010s here, and we were seeing that, both of them seem to be kind of distracted, looking at some form of, technologically mediated content, right? Here it is people on their smartphones. Here it is people on newspapers, right? Okay, they're not connecting with one another, and all that kind of thing. But it's because actually there's more similar than different in these two images, because the structures of society are largely quite the same in terms of how people relate to work, and what they are doing with their sort of daily lives. So even the idea of commuting and taking big, buses and subway cars of people around in these cities so that they can go and get to a place where they have to then spend their day to receive their income, that is a, more modern post-industrial way of life, basically, right? Even the idea of having to commute somewhere to work rather than it just being living off of your farm or wherever it is that you are, you have your craft shop and you live right there, right? The idea of having to go somewhere, using technology to get there, then doing your thing and then going back, that again is a more modern way of living, obviously, but one that would have been happening during both of these times. So that's why it's important, I think, to recognize that there actually is not as much different now as there would have been back then. Granted, of course, some things have definitely changed, especially representationally and things like that. But in terms of the more sort of down and dirty modes of production, means of production, and how it is owned and distributed, is quite similar. So we get back to the base and superstructure, right? So thinking about how the means of production, the technologies of a given point in history, and then thinking about, then who owns those technologies and how is that power enacted, then shapes a lot with the superstructure in society, which is the non-material things, the immaterial, right? So the more sort of conceptual, ideological parts of the society, then that can also maintain and shape the base. So again, trying to think about things in a broader landscape in this sort of way and understanding the relationship of a framework like this, it can just lead you to have a more informed understanding of kind of what's happening overall in terms of society and how things interact. Take a sip here. So the thing about the base and the superstructure and the means of production and all of this kind of stuff is that Marx really felt that all of these things intertwined together to develop something called the class struggle. So he deems this as the ongoing conflict between the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the workers, right? So if we look back at like these modes of production, right, the struggle between the people here and the people here, and then there's even probably someone off screen here who actually is the owner of the entire thing, right? And to Marx, that really was an evolving dynamic in society that he felt would lead to a lot of tension. So Marx believed that the capitalist structure creates a hierarchy of power and wealth. And then this illustration to the right from 1901 conveys this hierarchy a bit, right? It's sort of a cartoon, but it's just trying to demonstrate some of these ideas, right? So at the bottom, we work for all, we feed all. This is the workers down here sort of holding up this whole pyramid, where above them is maybe the managers, the landowners, landlords, factory owners, things like that, business owners. Then this is the sort of police, right? The military, we shoot at you. Okay, so we have the workers, we feed all, we work for all. Then one step up, we eat for you. So they're actually eating at a nice dining table here. Then we have we shoot you, which is sort of the military force, police force, things like that. We fool you. This is the religious institutions. And then we rule you here at the top. This would be the government institutions. And then right at the very top of that is the capitalist structure itself, which is represented by a big pot of money. So yeah, this is a cartoon interpretation of a way of trying to see this class pyramid that really was forming out of the industrialization of society in many ways. And, you know, what's important about this pyramid is that, you know, trying to think about how resistance pushing up of it is quite difficult. So if we think about the example of the Luddites from before, they would have been here at the bottom and they fought up this pyramid to try and say, and you know, protest against these machines taking over their livelihood that they felt. So they pushed up against this pyramid, but what ended up happening is that who actually held power, right? So the government institutions and the military, they pushed them down, and then that's when, you know, they went and murdered a bunch of Luddites and executed them and put them in prison, and then made it a law, right, in the superstructure of society that you could no longer break machines, and it would be sort of deemed a felony or an illegal activity, right? So that's what also Marx is really focused on, is that it's quite difficult to push up against this pyramid, but those who are already at the top can quite easily sort of push whatever they need down the bottom, and it gets all the way here, okay? This class struggle is something that maybe you have experienced in your life or noticed before, just living. And here, right, we see this is the interpretation from 1901, but then we have in 2021 a look at the global wealth pyramid, right? So we're seeing here at the top of this pyramid, this blue chunk right here. This represents nearly 50% of the wealth of the globe, and that's in the money over here. But in terms of the number of adults, it only represents nearly 1%, right? So this idea that 1% of the population is in control of 50% of all wealth in the world. Whereas, as we go down this pyramid, we see that in this wealth range, 53%, right, being the population, they have a share of around 1% of the wealth, right? So this idea of the 1%, if you've heard that term before, is that, yes, the 1% of the world owns half of the wealth, basically, whereas half of the world owns 1% of the wealth, right? So again, that's kind of a lot of flip-floppies with words and numbers there, but trying to let that sink in, it can let you start to see that, oh, okay, so at the top of this pyramid is where the majority of the wealth and power is held, and at the bottom of the pyramid is where the majority of people are, but that's not where the wealth is, right? So again, this wealth pyramid is something that would have come out of these the structure of society, right? That Marx found was really being accelerated through industrialization, and he was just sort of seeing that as this keeps going on, a pyramid like this is only going to keep expanding, and it's only going to keep getting smaller up here and larger down here as the wealth continues to move upward, rather than being more evenly dispersed or some other possibility. And this is just a funny, a quote from Kurt Vonnegut, from one of his books. I can't remember if it was Slaughterhouse-Five, but he says in it that in America, the poor see themselves not as exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? And this triangle at the top is actually people who have the value of over $1 million. And so, again, you would think, okay, well, if half the world is at the bottom of this pyramid, wouldn't there be some sort of resistance to try and change that? But ideologically, there is a lot that stops people from that resistance. And Kurt Vonnegut is saying here, because there is less of a consciousness among people at the bottom of the pyramid to see themselves as being exploited, and to instead think of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? Their opportunity is just right around the corner, or they just missed out on whatever grand business venture that they had thought of at one point, right? So again, that sort of ideological thing just helps maintain this kind of structure, hierarchical structure in society. So that leads to alienation, or this is just another key concept from Marx that does come, again, out of these dynamics that we've been discussing. So technology and alienation. With the rise of machines as a primary mode of production, workers feel disconnected from their labor, what Marx calls alienation. And alienation, just in terms of a straight definition, is the state or experience of being isolated from a group or an activity to which one should belong or in which one should be involved. So the idea of feeling alienated is kind of just this idea of feeling disconnected in some way from yourself, from others, from society. And Marx identified 4 types of alienation: alienation from the product of labor, from the labor process, from human potential, and from other workers. And so he, again, was very interested in how this all plays into the work context, right? Which in many ways does take the chunk of the majority of many humans' lives, right? So he was seeing the way that work was changing in this industrialization of society, and he was identifying experiences of alienation that would come from that dynamic, which he was seeing as basically, sort of a loss almost of people's inner souls in some way, which was being facilitated and happening because of all of these emergence of technologies and the way in which they are introduced into society and into the work of people. So one thing he looked at is the alienation from the product of labor. So the definition being that workers feel disconnected from the products they create due to a lack of ownership or control over the means of production. So if we look at a pre-industrial example, we can imagine a skilled artisan in a pre-industrial era craftsman's workshop creates custom-made furniture, owning the entire process from design to completion, right? They're seeing the entirety of this creation themselves. They are leading the process. They are crafting it with their own hands. This is a product of their labor. Whereas, once industrialization came around, a factory worker in the 19th century produces standardized goods in a factory, lacking influence over the final product's design, pricing, or distribution, right? And so also an artisan in a craftsman shop, if they're making a cabinet or something, that would probably take them quite a bit of time to make a single cabinet, right? But it would have this human element and touch to it. Whereas once factories and industrialization came around, you could make, 100 cabinets a day or something with the assembly line and with all of these introductions of technologies. But in doing so, the actual experience of the person making the cabinet, they now become way more divorced from that experience. And so you can imagine a skilled craftsman creating a cabinet, and then they go to the person's house later on and they see it. They might feel something within them about seeing their creation in the world, right? Something that they made with their hands. Whereas someone who maybe is on an assembly line, creating a cabinet, then if they went out in the world and saw that cabinet, they would not have as personal of a fulfilling connection with that thing, right? Instead, it's just some one of many thousands that they just sort of put a stamp on or put together in a factory, right? Not something that they created in a more fulfilling sort of way and environment. So Marx was interested in how the creation of things, the product of one's labor, was shifting from something that you could feel this connection to something that in many ways was kind of the whole point was to feel disconnected from it in the first place, right? Because you have no control in a factory or in an assembly line of how things are going to be made. You just do your one task that you're meant to do, and then you just keep it going infinitely. So that's the product of labor, the thing itself. Then he also talked about alienation from the labor process. So the definition being workers experience powerlessness and lack of control over the organization and execution of their work. So once again, in pre-industrialization, a skilled blacksmith in a pre-industrial era could decide when and how to forge tools, having autonomy over the entire crafting process, right? Maybe they had a client of someone who needed a specific tool by a specific time, but the process of how in which that blacksmith created the thing was up to them, right? So much more like an independent contractor kind of thing, right? They had the freedom in their day of when they wanted to wake up and make this thing. Sure, there might have been a deadline of when the person would have needed it, but they could inform for themselves how they would go about doing that thing. Instead, in the industrialization age, a textile mill worker in the 19th century would operate machinery for long hours, performing repetitive tasks with little influence over work conditions or processes, right? So first, we're looking at the product itself of the labor, right? That's the specific cabinet, the thing that's being made. But now we're looking at the process. So how you would go about making that cabinet. At one point, you had more freedom over if it was just you creating a thing. But as soon as things became more industrialized, suddenly you were being told how to do that thing, right? Your labor process was being dictated by someone other than you. And the time that you're spending making this thing was not your own choosing, but instead what was being told to you of how you had to do it. Right. And so through that, right, there's another form of alienation that happens where the freedom of how you go about creating a thing is lost. And instead, you're just sort of following repetitive tasks and you're clocking in to work at a certain time and leaving at a certain time. But you have no influence or connection to the labor process itself as you may in a more sort of artisan crafts type situation. Next, the alienation from human potential. So the definition being that workers are prevented from expressing their full creative and intellectual capacities in their work. So we go back to a pre-industrial example where an artisan in a pre-industrial society could create unique handcrafted items, showcasing their full range of creative skills, right? Once again, looking at the cabinet, the blacksmith, this person in this AI image is making some sort of bowls or something. However, they do have a sewing machine, so I'm not sure what they're making there. But there was a level of artistry and creativity to what you were making, right? You could express yourself in some way through that creation. Whereas in a more industrialized environment, a factory worker in the 19th century repetitively assembles identical products, restricting their use of their creative abilities. So all these things really overlap, right? I mean, the creation of the thing itself, having less control over the labor process of how that thing is created, and then once again your own creativity is being lost in that process too, which is why your human potential is kind of being stripped from you in some way as well, because what is your point of living at that point, right? Not to get super dark with it, but it's like, yeah, the human potential that you have within you for creative and intellectual capacity is not being utilized in an industrial environment where you're just there fulfilling a very basic sort of task compared to the creation of a thing that uses your hands and your skills and your talents in its own creative way to fulfill you, right? To feel something, basically. Again, alienation is all about that disconnection from that feeling that's facilitated in these environments. And then alienation from other workers. So workers experience isolation and lack of collaboration due to competition and fragmented roles. So in a pre-industrialized society, potentially, artisans in a pre-industrial guild could collaborate, share knowledge and skills to enhance the overall quality of craftsmanship. Whereas with the onset of industrialization, factory workers then started competing with one another for wages, for job security, creating a sense of rivalry, right? So just the dynamic of workers with each other went to something where rather than seeing your coworkers as collaborators, it kind of was then seeing them more as rivals, right? There's only a limited amount of resources coming from up top, and if you want to be getting the most of it, you have to compete against who's sitting next to you to be the better worker or whatever, right? To eventually try and rise up to get more resources. But it moves away from a collaborative relationship and more towards a competitive one, which makes you then be alienated from the people that you would be working with because you are competing with them for resources rather than sharing with them for collaboration or anything like that, right? So, and again, these are very sort of extreme examples. Again, a little bit more binary type examples we're looking at here, but that's for me to try and really drive these points forward, right, to make them clearer. So how in which industrialization created alienating experiences in terms of how people changed the way that they worked, right? And these are the same things that the Luddites would have been experiencing and feeling, and that's why they resisted this whole shift, because they were moving away from their own power and individuality in how they do things, and instead were now being dictated by machines and the people who own those machines, right? And they weren't really given much opportunity to not, right? So that's why they fought against it and the resulting thing that happened. So those are 4 types of alienation that Marx identified through this, again, shifting dynamic in the way people work, which if we go all the way back to earlier in this slide about historical materialism, the base and superstructure, he was seeing the mode of production of society changing with the integration of these new technologies during industrialization. Through that process, he was realizing that the mode of production was shifting. And so what's going to come out of that? And being someone who was more focused on the experience of the workers, he wasn't thinking about all of the wealth that would have been coming out of these developments or how in which it could be used for entrepreneurial reasons or anything like that. He was looking at, okay, the majority of people who are going to be impacted by this are going to be those working in these situations. So what is being lost in that transition, right? And that's why he was starting to really look at these things like alienation, because that's really gets more core at the human experience, right? This idea of being someone who lives on this planet for a certain period of time. What is that time spent doing, and how does it make you feel, right? That's what he was really kind of focused on. So the activity now for you to do is to consider alienation today. And so what I want you to reflect on and consider is to identify modern examples of Marx's 4 types of alienation, from the product of labor, from the labor process, from human potential, and from other workers. Put your examples on the provided whiteboard. There's a link on Blackboard as sticky notes under each relevant section. And I would request that each student puts one sort of example under all 4 of these. So you should have 4 examples of modern alienation, one for each of these different types of alienation, as a way to demonstrate that you understand these ideas, right? And you're able to apply them to instances of today. And I say here as a tip, consider sharing any personal experiences you have had with any of the identified forms of alienation. Are there these things that maybe you've experienced before in jobs that you've had, right? And this is really meant to draw the link between looking at things more historically, right, in Marx's period of time, and drawing those connections now to today, to thinking about how do new technologies, right, digital technologies and these things, how do they create forms of alienation, right? Me doing this class in this way, where I'm recording this video for you to watch, of course, there's benefits to that, right? There's freedom, and now you get to choose when you're going to watch this, and things like that. But by very nature of this technologically sort of mediated form of communication, it is alienating, because there's no connection happening here, right? There's no live reaction or way of connecting with you as I'm doing this experience. So this in itself is alienating, right? And I'm not saying that as a complaint. I'm saying that as a reflection of this experience, right? Again, this is a technology, this laptop, the internet, all these things that I'm integrating with are parts of my daily work life. But that process can make alienating experiences like this compared to more traditional of just being in a classroom, talking about these things, seeing your faces, having those sort of connections. That is a less alienating experience, right? And these are just sort of in terms of the definitions of what is and isn't alienating. Those are some ways to think about that, right? So even you as a student watching this video is more alienating, right? Because it's just something that you're watching you're not having that sort of push and pull sort of relationship with it. And again, there's benefits to that, but there also is shifts that just happen in that dynamic. So again, that's just me reflecting on my own experience right now of this, because yeah, this computer wasn't here. Like the idea of someone just sitting at a desk speaking openly about these things to seemingly no one, right, for however long it's been. I don't know if it's been 45 minutes. That would be a strange experience. But because this technology is here, it compels that to actually happen. It creates that environment where that's a possibility. And through that possibility, things are felt and experienced. And what is felt and experienced? Anyway, so that's me reflecting, but I want you to reflect on your own experiences, right? But you can find examples that aren't your own personal examples. Maybe you haven't felt these forms of alienation before. But I just think it would be interesting, of course, to have personal examples integrated if you're comfortable sharing them. But yes, one example for all for these to receive full credit for the activity. These are just sort of quick definitions of each of these forms of alienation if you want to reference it while you're completing that activity. And then just as a review of this module, this video, it looked at historical materialism. So history can be understood by the ways that modes of production have changed over time, influencing the base and superstructure of societies. Those who control the base, the means of production, hold significant power over other aspects of society, the superstructure, right? So it really is not just about what are the means of production in a given period of history of society, but who owns those means of production, and how does that dynamic and relationship then inform other aspects of society. And we looked at alienation. The rise of industrialization and the way technologies are integrated into work and life has led to forms of alienation which persists today. And I think we even see it a lot in things like social media and the internet, things which fundamentally connect people, oddly enough, has created an experience, an environment where people feel more disconnected than ever, right? That's alienation. That's what that feeling is. And that's due to the integration of technologies. So just thinking about applying some of these ideas to what's happening more today is what I'm trying to get you to do and compel you to do in these exercises. So thank you very much for listening and watching. And these slides are available for you to go through and refer to on your own as well.